can see the tendency towards displacing education with indoctrination becoming stronger and stronger. And although now and again you find parents resisting this, you find people speaking out against this, you'll find that as the decades go by and as communities become a little bit weaker, their idea of solidarity and their commitment to moral values diminishes a little bit. So the indoctrination element becomes more and more important in education. We have a more extreme version of what this sociologist was talking about, because today we have a situation where in many schools in England or America, they teach young people that whiteness is a problem, that white people should check their privilege, that you as a white boy or a white girl should defer to others who are not white, because in some shape or form your ancestors bear the burden of historical guilt. You have a situation which I find particularly disturbing, where very often you have teachers tell children not to tell their parents what they've been discussing about gender and sex, and about the fact that there's, that sex and men and women aren't just simply biological, but are constructed socially, and therefore we have to be open to the idea there are many, many genders. And I've talked to numerous parents who discover one afternoon that their children has been discussing these things, and these are very young children, 6, 7, 8, or 9, being indoctrinated into a worldview that is very different than those of their parents.
I recently spoke with Abigail Shira on this, and what's really interesting, of course, is that when it comes to gender dysphoria, if it were really science and data-based, you would expect the same sort of patterns to emerge regardless of colour or class or economic well-being. But in fact, the explosion in the number of children presenting with dysphoria turns out to be very much concentrated in middle and upper class American white families, daughters of middle and upper class white families, which tells you straight away that there must be all sorts of societal and cultural practices actually inducing this, rather than it being something that can be verified by the data and by science and by reason.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. If you look at this question over the long term, you'll find that all these innovations in values to do with sex and gender and human behavior first kick in the elite schools, usually the elite private schools in the Anglo-American world. That's really where they first become popularized. And then over the decades, they gradually seep down into the rest of society. And that's really how these things work. And I think what you'll find is that very often in schools, all you need to have is 2 or 3 children coming from a relatively affluent fairly culturally enriched families, who decide, for example, that it's really cool to cut their arms and cut themselves. And then it just gets completely, you have an epidemic of kids in that school cutting themselves. And similarly with trans culture, all you need is 2 or 3 kids saying, I'm a boy living in a girl's body, before other boys begin to come out and say, I too have certain similar attitudes, and I too want to identify as a girl. And I think that kind of copycat effect in these schools is really quite striking, and there are numerous examples of that kind of give you evidence about how this really kind of works.
Yeah, it seems to me that one of the things that has come with this identity crisis, where it seems that these days, instead of saying, for example, I think, therefore I am, we say, I feel, therefore I am. And you talk about this in the book, this concept of the enormous difficulty of finding your own identity, and that very few people do it satisfactorily. Perhaps part of the problem is that young girls particularly, we know, particularly need affirmation. But all young people do. And the way to get affirmation seems to be to go online, say I'm a victim, I'm trapped in the wrong body, or I'm uncertain about whatever, and the affirmation pours in. It's a way to really be affirmed and to be told how fantastic you are for standing up and so forth. I wonder whether it doesn't, in fact, lead to further confusion down the road.
Yes, but even before this, there's a big problem because we know that the way that young people successfully overcome their identity crisis is one of three ways, either through what they achieve. So the fact that they've achieved something in the world, they really kind of master the language. They become very good at pottery. They've been really good at their job. That sense of achievement gives people a strong sense of who they are. Secondly, I think it's done through action, the way you kind of make an impact on the world, the quality of the relationships you're able to establish for yourself. And finally, and most importantly, the identity crisis is overcome through having a strong sense of vocation, a sense of purpose about who you are. What is it that you want to do in the world? What makes you, in a sense, a person, and what do you want to do with yourself? What is the goal and objective of your life? And these three elements that are critical for identity formation are all discouraged in our education system, because in our education system we tend to displace these accomplishments with what I call the psychology of validation, where you argue that the way you give kids strong identity is by giving them smiley faces, is by telling them how good they are, by raising their self-esteem, by making them feel good. And there's this kind of bizarre notion that making you feel good is somehow going to give you the confidence to be able to overcome your identity crisis, rather than make you dependent, which is what it does. It makes you dependent on the recognition of others. So you become entirely powerless to make your own way in the world as a result of this.